I wanted to come on and talk about an aspect of my gaming history that really is central to this channel and that has informed a lot of what I've done over the many years that I've been on YouTube, and that is import gaming and my history with import gaming. And it's probably fairly standard in the beginning for people who grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. And I always had this background knowledge that the hobby that I got into back then, in my case with the NES, from that time period on was very much a Japanese invention. I knew from the start, likely through my parents, that the NES just was something different, something unique, and something that really was not American. And I kind of recall my parents talking about their video gaming, and that came in the late 70s, back when they were dating and got married, playing Pac-Man and some of the Atari games in the arcades, pre-Crash. And then they fell out of it and probably didn't think about it again until the Nintendo came out. And so I think we were just at that time within or just past that Japanese economic boom. And I kind of remember my father saying to me as I was playing Nintendo in those first years that these Japanese companies, they're so innovative. Everything you're doing here is because of Japanese innovation and Japanese industrial strength and stuff like that. And I guess that kind of, at that point, went in one ear and almost out the other, but I knew that my hobby was different than sports or action figures or stuff like that. That it felt like I was playing something that was really new to the country. Now, my first exposure to Japanese gaming culture beyond that sort of background knowledge was through EGM. I got my first electronic gaming monthly subscription, I would say back in the early to mid 90s, and they would always do an international section. And I felt like that was really the first time that I got to look behind the curtain into what seemed like the generative nexus of this hobby. You would see games that hadn't been released here, and you would kind of dream about them and wonder, with that little paragraph or two that EGM would devote to those games, you'd wonder what it could be like, and then lo and behold, the games would come out, whether it was The Secret of Mana, The Illusion of Gaia. And every time I got that magazine, I love that preview section. I love that international section because it created an excitement that is unmatched in today's world. I mean, this was before the internet. These screenshots and those brief write-ups were the only information that you would get on these games. And all of a sudden, you would go into, in my case, being on the East Coast, a Bradley's or a Toys R Us, and you'd see a game on the shelf, and if you could look at the back, you'd say, oh yeah, that was what I read about all those months ago. So I feel like those magazines helped me deepen my knowledge of the foreign origin of these games, and it made me feel connected to a different cultural world, even if back then I couldn't quite articulate why that was appealing to me. I just like the idea that there was a thread, a kind of cultural thread in these games that connected to another country. Now, in those magazines, there was always a section in the back that would have advertisements for companies that would allow you to import some of these games. And I could never do that. I was too young at the time to have any autonomy over money or even have my own money. So I would just dream about doing that, but I never really had the means to do it. When I first started having that little bit of autonomy over some allowance and some birthday gifts and things like that, I managed to buy my first import game, believe it or not, from Sears. And what this was Kemco Virtual Professional Baseball for the Virtual Boy. I had just purchased a Virtual Boy. It might have been late 95, kind of after it was failing, and I think I got that at a discount and picked up a couple of games, sort of the heavy hitters at the time, Wario World and the golf game and Red Alarm were the first three that I had. And then after playing those, I was like, well, I want another Virtual Boy game. And I remember going to Sears for whatever reason. I would sort of go there with my father every now and again, and he'd let me sort of walk around. And there was a Virtual Boy game on the shelf that I think was about $20. I didn't know what it was, and I just asked for it. And was it a good game? Not really. It was just, I think, like a Japanese professional baseball game with cutesy characters in 3D. I played it quite a bit because it was one of the only things that I had, but I just always looked at that game fondly then and now because it was something from behind that cultural curtain that had leaked out here for whatever reason. And I just saw it as this unique artifact from another world. And that was it as far as import gaming in my childhood. It wasn't until I was an adult and living on my own in grad school that I made my first serious forays into import gaming. So what led me to it was when you're in grad school and you're kind of working on your thesis, or at least this is the way I was so kind of absorbed into what I was doing professionally that I felt like I just needed a break on the weekends, and I started looking for something that was so different and distinct from how I was spending my week mentally. I just wanted to totally disconnect, and what that was for me was Japanese culture, some kind of lingering interest that I had as a kid, a sense that I never really explored the interest in Japanese culture fully, and so it led me to things like watching some classic anime, reading some manga that friends had or talked about, but that I just never really was interested in back then. And it led me to Japanese wrestling. As a kind of a lifelong wrestling fan, I recall really being interested in All Japan Pro Wrestling back in the late 90s, when again, this stuff would leak out from behind that cultural curtain. And I, through friends who did some tape trading, saw matches between the great stars of the time, Misawa, Kobashi, Akira Taue, and I was like, oh my God, this is so much better than the wrestling we had over here in the U.S., even though that was the WCW versus WWF War, Monday Night War era, which is, in retrospect, pretty great. But I always remember, like, oh, I'd really love to follow All Japan more than I did. And at that time, I was like, well, now the internet's up and running, and you don't have to wait for a VHS tape from a friend. So I started scouring the internet, and I was like, I want to watch some matches with Misawa. And this was, interestingly and sadly, the very same week that he passed away. He died in the ring. And I was really kind of a little bit, had a little bit of melancholy about that, and kind of sad that I missed a good portion of his career. So I wanted to go back and watch a lot of his matches. And through searching the internet, I discovered Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 for the N64. And Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 was a game that I didn't know existed. And that was a version of a game that I really loved back in the day, and that was the WCW versus NWO games, and then ultimately WWE WrestleMania 2000, No Mercy, on the N64. I knew there was a Japanese version of the first N64 game, but I believe it was just, it was basically the American game with a couple extra characters, and obviously Japanese language. But Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 was really the pinnacle of that series. So kind of enjoying the internet for what it was. I was like, well, I need to play this. I imported the game from Japan, complete in box, and Googled around to see how can I actually play this in my N64. And I discovered this very crude trick back then, I mean, still works today, of removing the plastic tabs in the N64 that prevented the Japanese carts from fitting in. So you had to like Dremel them away, or I think it was like remove a plastic piece and then Dremel it down or something like that. Anyway, I did a crude job, but it worked. And the effort was worth it because that was such a great game. And it really got me to thinking, hey, what other games am I missing? And that brought me down the rabbit hole of importing. So my next target became the PlayStation 2. I knew it had a very, very rich library of interesting Japanese games, and the interest in wrestling took me to King of Colosseum, which admittedly wasn't the wonderful game that Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 was, but nonetheless, it had the same allure. I was playing these wrestling games that were just unreleased and that would never be released here. Now, how I played the games on the PlayStation 2 was by using something called a swap magic kit. Did a video on that here on the channel a while ago, and it worked really well for importing, and I started importing some PlayStation 2 games, and it just kind of snowballed from there. Now, around the same time, I had also purchased a PlayStation 3, and I knew, obviously, now we had the PlayStation Network, and there were stores, and I wondered, could I get onto the Japanese PSN? Could I create an account? And sure enough, there was a YouTube video, this is way back in 2008, that talked about how to create a Japanese PSN account. And it involved, if I recall correctly, providing an address in Japan. And there was one address in Japan, which was a hotel somewhere in Tokyo, that for whatever reason, the PSN would verify that as your residence. And then you had to add funding to the account, but you couldn't use a U.S. credit card because this was a hotel, and they wouldn't allow you to use a credit card issued in the United States or any other country. So I had to actually find websites that would sell codes, Japanese PSN credit, and of course I purchased them at a very bad conversion rate, but it allowed me to fill up my Japanese PSN account with money and buy Japanese PlayStation 3 games and PSP games and old PlayStation 1 releases. And this is kind of how I got into Mahjong and found demos for stuff that would never come out over here. It was actually quite a good time to kind of sit down, it's Friday night, have a drink, and just discover what I could discover on the Japanese PlayStation store way back when. Now, it sounds a little shady, like searching out people who would resell the codes, but I was never scammed other than, paying too much. And in the process, this is how I discovered PlayAsia. So PlayAsia was one of those sites that sold the codes. Now, their system was kind of, it just took a while for whatever reason. Like, you would have to do it well in advance. And then I found another site that I can't remember. It's probably not even in business. It was more or less a blog of somebody in Japan. It was like Japanese codes or game codes Japan or something like that. And you'd buy it, and it was mailed out to you within an hour. And I'll come back to PlayAsia. But I just want to talk about one of the games that I discovered through the PSN, the Japanese PSN, was the Yakuza series, Yakuza 4. And I couldn't really play it because it was in Japanese, but I'm like, what is this game? It's kind of like Shenmue, and then I read up about it, and I was like, oh yeah, they were U.S. versions of the first two games on the PlayStation 2, so I went out and I played those, and that's how I got into the whole Yakuza series. It was really the highlight of those sessions on the Japanese PlayStation Network. Now, before I move on, I want to talk about the language barrier. And of course, that is one of the main obstacles to getting into import gaming, is if you don't speak Japanese, you're spending money on these things that you can't play. I always looked at that as a challenge. It was part of the fun. Now, I did say I went out and I learned enough Japanese to read the menus of these games. So I knew how to save. I could read the game modes. I could figure out enough. And of course, each game was different as far as the difficulty of doing that. But I could figure out enough to play any genre outside of role-playing games. And, you know, it didn't take a lot of effort to learn hiragana and katakana, you know, just to play these games. Couldn't converse, couldn't really read anything beyond that. And of course, RPGs were sort of closed off to me, and that was always one of the genres that I loved. I would still buy them, and I would try like hell to see how far I could get in them, but as far as like basic gameplay, it was enough, and it was part of the fun, and it was part of the work to get to that other side of the curtain, to get to where games were born. And that's how I saw it, and it still has that allure for me today. So let's come back to PlayAsia. PlayAsia was, I mean, if I'm discovering it, it wasn't brand new, because I never really got to the, you know, I was really never in the beginning of any trend, but it was relatively new. It wasn't established yet, but I mean, what a great site. If your console was modded, or you had a region-free console like the PSP, PS Vita, it really was a treasure trove. And the games would get here quickly for the time. You know, you'd only have to wait a week, maybe 2 weeks. And I bought so many games from PlayAsia, in addition to magazines and art books. It's really how I built up my Mahjong video game collection. And I've always been a customer. It's funny, I was looking through all my orders from PlayAsia. I just got an order recently, which was the physical version of River City Girls, the second River City Girls. Actually, it has the first and the second on the Switch, and the Japanese versions of the Tsukio Shooters collection with all the like 1945 games. And just going back, it was like after I bought that, I was clicking through my history, and it's just so many memories of all the games that I bought through that site. Now, at the same time, eBay, the Japanese sellers were coming on to eBay, and I made use of all of those. I loved buying, just discovering new games, and if they were cheap, and I could get them for my price was always $20. If I get something interesting for $20 or less, I would import it. And I was importing stuff for the Saturn, and I talked about Saturn as being like the system that I really imported. That's where I have my most import games, is on the Saturn. And I'm not going to get too far into the Saturn, because I did a video last year on 10 years of being a Saturn collector. So I've pretty much said everything that I wanted to say about the Sega Saturn. But, that was a console, and I even knew it back in the day. You had to import to enjoy the Saturn, and I could finally do that through eBay. Now, of course, it's expensive now, but I would say back, 2011 to 2018, somewhere in that range, you could get complete in-box Super Famicom games. I remember just this morning, I was looking for something in my game collection. I came across this lot of complete in-box, absolutely mint Super Famicom games that I got for $90. I think there were like 7 or 8 perfect Super Famicom games, $80-$90 shipped. And it was, they were good games. They were Bomberman, Gundam Gomon 2, one of the Puyo Puyo games, the Sailor Moon side-scrolling beat-em-up, a Hokuto no Ken game side-scrolling beat-em-up, and Doraemon, I believe, and there's one other. It's kind of like a female ninja game, which was a side-scrolling beat-em-up game. So, really no... Oh, and Nichibutsu Mahjong, which is, has a bit of a language barrier, but as a Mahjong fan, I love that game. So I got, like I said, all of those pristine condition, and I'm like, those days are over. And, of course, post-pandemic, you'll never find that, but that wasn't unusual back in the day. Now, what I loved about importing games from eBay is I always found that the condition of the games that I got was excellent. I mean, far exceeding in many cases what I was getting from the United States. It seemed like back then, good condition. Like if a Japanese seller said a game was in good condition, it meant, maybe it was missing an obi strip, in the case of the Saturn, or there was an innocuous scuff on the case, or, if you're getting something from the Super Famicom, one of the corners might have been a little dented. But you would get something like from the U.S. that was in quote-unquote good condition, and that could have included cracks and sticker residue, and rat feces, or actually all of the above in some cases. But you never had that variance from Japan. Everything I got was incredibly good condition. And then just kind of continuing on where to get your import stuff. More recently, I learned that you could order off of Amazon Japan, which I've done on a few occasions, and the shipping is lightning fast. I mean, in some cases, I would get stuff like with Amazon US Prime Speed. Absolutely amazing. But it's expensive. The shipping's expensive. And I've actually made use of it more for magazines and art books and gaming books than I have, for importing games. But, of course, it's a lot easier to import today than it was back then. The flip side is gaming is becoming rather standardized. And games release globally on the same day. There aren't really a lot of games that, are in Japan that are exclusive to Japan that you want to play and that aren't going to come out here. Inevitably, those games will be translated and come out here, or they'll be released in a Asian edition with English language, which is awesome. I don't want to complain. If you had told me that as a kid, that we'd get to a point where any Japanese game you'd want to play could, be available in one form or fashion or another, and you could buy it, and it wouldn't be super expensive, and it would get here within a week. That would have been a fantasy land. So I'm not complaining. It's just that, especially AAA games, they're just standardized experiences. So you're not going to find that gem that no one knows about that you can still play. Obviously, visual novels and sort of the fan service games, those are the Japanese exclusive genres. And honestly, when those games come out here, they're not always great, and the ones that don't come out, you're really not missing. But I'm always searching. I'm always on the search for import games that are fun to play, that are accessible from a language standpoint, and that won't necessarily come out here. And I would say, again, the example of River City Girls, the games that have physical versions in Japan that don't have physical versions here would really be the only ones that at least I'm finding and picking up these days. So I want to end by talking about some of my favorite imports over the years, beyond virtual pro wrestling too. And I'll talk about some games that I just think are examples of interesting finds that you could get back in the day. And then I'll just talk about, I think, some of the high-quality games that I've mentioned over the years, and I'll just do a quick rundown of those. So the first example of I think, a truly interesting game was Another Century's Episode R. Now, this was in that PlayStation 3 era of importing that I was doing off of PlayAsia. And this game, listen, it's not one of my favorites, but it was a game that if you liked Japanese sort of Robotech type anime. This had a lot of the famous characters and robots from those shows all in one release. They somehow got around the licensing. It's, difficulties. It's kind of like the Super Robot Wars games, but with, for the time, impressive looking 3D. At its core, this game essentially fits into like the Dragon Ball Z 3D fighters, where you can kind of move freely on a 3D battlefield. You can ascend and descend. And I never really liked those games because I thought that there was so much freedom of movement that the fighting became difficult. And yet once you figured out, it was kind of a rinse and repeat experience, whether you played Dragon Ball Z, Budokai on the GameCube or the PlayStation 3 to a lot of the games now. It's that same Bandai Namco engine running it. But I think this game did it well, and it was a game that wasn't going to come out here because you couldn't get the Macross license and some of these other licenses. So if you were into those type of games, if you like those games, this is one that was Japan exclusive. And if you, like me, you didn't necessarily like those games, but they could hold your interest for a while, again, this was one that was unique because you knew you were never going to get it here. So this next game is an example of a situation where I bought a game that was unique, that was interesting, and that was Japan exclusive, and I essentially got a preview of what was to come when they released it in the West, and that was Namco Cross Capcom. Now, this game was right up my alley. It was a strategy RPG, sort of a grid-based strategy RPG, and it was a really good one. It was text-heavy in the sense that there was a lot of text. There was some kind of a story going on. I couldn't figure it out, but I could figure out the battle system, and I learned the battle system, and I enjoyed having these kind of like dream matchups and combining characters and figuring out, do I guard, do I go for the special move, how to manage my, various stats to progress through the game. So it was a game that I spent a good deal of time with. And when they finally released this game, well, not this game, but they released the sequels, Project X Zone and Project X Zone 2 here in the U.S., I kind of looked back and I was like, oh, now that I can understand the story wasn't that important. Again, it's a fun battle system. If you like strategy RPGs, it's great fan service. I had a blast with those games, but I previewed it on the PlayStation 2, and I had a blast doing it, and I always look back fondly on that game. Another, for me anyway, great and unique find was a game called Yakuman DS. I've talked about this on the channel in my survey of Mahjong games. It's from a while ago, but it is basically Mario Kart as a Mahjong game. You can play competitive Mahjong with all of the Nintendo characters. They have different stats, and I'm not going to go into how it plays out in a Mahjong game, but it was a fun take on a genre of games that I really liked. And it's one of those Nintendo games that will never come out here. And I learned enough about Mahjong and learned enough Japanese that I could play it and enjoy it. And I think that is kind of the essence of why you import. Now, I've talked about this next game on the channel, and I have a discrete review of it up, and that's Fist of the North Star on the PlayStation 2, one of my first PlayAsia orders. And when I started researching, like, okay, what import games should I play on the PlayStation 2, everyone was talking about this online who had discovered it. I loved Fist of the North Star. It has some of the most beautiful graphics, I think, on the PlayStation 2, just the fluidity of the animation, the fight system. It's one of those Arc System Works games. So it's like Guilty Gear or BlazBlue, but it certainly came out, I think, before the BlazBlue series, and Guilty Gear preceded it. I mean, Guilty Gear, I believe, was out even on the original PlayStation, where it was a very early PlayStation 2 game. But this refined that art style. and it had a different enough battle system where I could play this Fist of the North Star for hours, but I always found myself burning out on Guilty Gear. And it remains a game that I don't believe has ever been released outside of Japan. It never has had another sequel, but it captured that series so well. I had heard of Fist of the North Star, and I want to say that I had seen a bit of it as a teenager. But this game made me go back and actually watch some of the original episodes, and it's such a perfect tie-in. I mean, I'm tempted to say it's the best Fist of the North Star game out there. There have been many. I haven't played all of them. A close second would be that one on the PlayStation 4 that it was kind of like a mashup of Yakuza and Fist of the North Star. Good game in its own right, but there was just something so focused and pure about this game, and it was a really fun fighting game. On the Super Famicom, Gundam Gomon 2, talked about this, love this game. This is, I think, one of the classic platformers on the Super Famicom / Super Nintendo. I think it's tragically overlooked by people who enjoy that genre of game. And I'm not saying it's a fault of anyone, I mean, if you didn't play it and you don't search it out, it's not a series that gets a ton of attention, except for the fact that the games that did come out in the US that were more, I would say, action RPGs, and they're now super expensive. But Gundam Gomon 2, I always said it reminded me of the Konami Tiny Toons game on the Genesis, which I loved. Played the heck out of that, but it just had more visual flair, it had more challenge, it had great music. Just one of the best Super Famicom experiences that you could have. Another Super Famicom game that I loved was Battle Robot Retsuden. It's a standard grid-based strategy RPG, again, combining battle robots from a lot of different anime. But it had a speed, and it had an accessibility, and the language barrier wasn't too bad. So, I really played through this game, didn't beat it. I mean, there was a point where I think I was missing something, but I got my money's worth, where I just played this game a lot and really enjoyed it. So I don't know if it's expensive today or if it's still cheap, but if it is cheap and you have a means of playing these Super Famicom games here, whether it's the Hyperkin system or something like that, check it out or download the ROM. There might have been an English patch at some point. It's really, I think, worth it. Street Fighter Alpha 3 for the Saturn. This was just one of those Saturn games that I did have to talk about. Of all the great import games that you can get for the Saturn, I always loved this one because it was an example of the Saturn even outperforming the Dreamcast. It was better than the PlayStation version. It was a game that stands as an example of why you wanted to import for the Saturn. Super smooth animation, minimal load times for a fighting game of this era on that system. And it was just the high point of Street Fighter. It did everything well for the 2D Street Fighter games. Even though it's not my favorite, I much prefer Alpha 2 as a overall game, but as a technical feat, Alpha 3 was incredible on the Saturn. And then lastly, a game that I've talked about before, Fate Unlimited Code for the PlayStation 2. It is a 3D-ish Capcom fighter. It's not quite like a Tekken type of 3D fighter. You're kind of forced onto the same plane, but you can rotate a little bit, and there's some nice 3D in the sort of super moves or special moves that you can pull off. But it was an anime series that I wasn't familiar with. It was a game series that I wasn't familiar with. But this game just hit right. It was a really fun Capcom fighter, and I spent a lot of time learning the special moves, learning how to play the different characters. Had nice, smooth animation, great music, more of a muted soundtrack, but it worked well. And again, it felt like it was something special because I just knew it would never come out here. So those are my experiences with import gaming. Again, it's something that I think has always been evident on this channel, but now as I'm getting a little bit older and sort of looking back on my time in the hobby, in retrospect, just finally stepping into the import gaming scene, even though it was a little bit later than I'm sure other people, has been so rewarding and such a major part of why I still am so engaged in this hobby.